One woman buried her husband, then another, then possibly a third. She exposed floorboards and dug shallow graves, the stench of rot seeping through a farmhouse no one dared visit. By the time authorities finally searched Lizzie Halliday's property, she had been married at least 4 times, and almost none of those men were still breathing. Was she a monster hiding in plain sight? Or was she something the law had never been built to catch? America had a habit of swallowing people whole, and Eliza Margaret McNally was exactly the kind of person it liked to digest. She arrived from County Antrim, Ireland, sometime in the 1860s. The exact year is uncertain, because the records from that era were about as reliable as the ships that carried immigrants across the Atlantic. What we do know is that she was young, she was alone, and she landed in a country that had a very specific use for Irish women: scrubbing floors, washing linens, and staying invisible. And for a while, Lizzie did exactly that. She took domestic work wherever she could find it, moving through the lower rungs of New York's economy the way thousands of immigrant women did, quietly and without leaving much of a trace. But here is where Lizzie starts to diverge from the usual story. Most women in her position stayed in one place, built small networks, maybe married once if they were fortunate. Lizzie married repeatedly, and the men she married had a tendency to stop existing. Now, let me be clear about something, because the newspapers of the 1890s were not clear about it at all. The exact number of Lizzie's marriages is still debated. Some historians count 4, some count as many as 6. The records contradict each other, partly because marriage documentation made in rural New York during this period was inconsistent, and partly because Lizzie herself moved frequently and was not exactly forthcoming with personal details. She changed names, she changed towns, she changed stories. What is not debated is the pattern. Husband after husband either died, disappeared, or fled. Some of those deaths were later called suspicious by neighbors and journalists. But suspicious is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence, because at the time, nobody investigated. Nobody filed reports. Nobody connected one dead husband in one county to another missing husband 3 counties over. The system simply was not built to notice. And that is the detail that makes Lizzie Halliday's story more than just a true crime curiosity. The 1870s and 80s America had almost no infrastructure for tracking a woman who crossed county lines and reinvented herself. No centralized records, no coordinated law enforcement. If you wanted to vanish and reappear as someone slightly different, all you needed was a new town and a short memory. Lizzie had both, and she was just getting started. If you wanted to disappear in the 1870s America, you didn't need a disguise. You needed a wagon and a different county. Lizzie understood this better than most. After her first marriage collapsed, she didn't sit still. She moved, changed details, found new towns where nobody knew her name or her history, and then she married again. The specifics of her early marriages are frustratingly unclear, not because historians haven't tried to pin them down, but because the records from this period are riddled with gaps. Marriage certificates were filed inconsistently. Death records in rural counties were sometimes nothing more than a line in a church ledger. And Lizzie, whether by instinct or intention, operated in exactly the spaces where documentation was weakest. What the scattered records do show is a pattern that gets harder to explain the longer you look at it. At least 2 of her early husbands died under circumstances that neighbors later described as sudden and unexpected. No autopsies were performed. No inquests were opened. In rural New York during this era, A man dying of a stomach ailment or a sudden fever was tragic, but it was also Tuesday. Illness moved fast, medicine was crude, and nobody thought twice about a widow grieving at a graveside she may have helped fill. But it wasn't just the deaths. Fires followed Lizzie from town to town. Property would burn at suspiciously convenient moments, sometimes right after an insurance policy had been taken out, sometimes right before she needed a reason to relocate. She was also linked to a string of thefts, small enough to avoid serious prosecution, large enough to fund her next chapter. The woman was not just volatile, she was resourceful. Now, here is where the story gets uncomfortable for reasons beyond the obvious. Some of Lizzie's husbands did not die. They left. They abandoned her, or she abandoned them, and the marriages simply dissolved without legal formality because divorce was expensive and complicated, and, frankly, optional if you were willing to just walk away. So the question becomes, how many of these men were victims of violence, and how many were just victims of a bad marriage, in an era where walking away was easier than filing paperwork? The honest answer is that we cannot say with certainty. The sensational press of the 1890s would later collapse every missing husband into a murder victim, because that made a better headline. But the historical record is murkier than the newspapers wanted it to be. What is not murky is Lizzie's reputation. By the late 1880s, she was known across Sullivan County as someone you stayed away from. Neighbors locked doors. Landlords refused her tenancy. The local sheriff had her name memorized. Everyone could see the danger. Nobody had the legal tools to do anything about it. Not yet. Paul Halliday was old enough to know better. He married Lizzie anyway. By the early 1890s, Lizzie had landed in Sullivan County, New York, and attached herself to a quiet, aging farmer named Paul Halliday. Paul owned property, and he had a modest income. And by all surviving accounts, he had absolutely no idea what he was walking into. To be fair, it would have been nearly impossible for him to know. Lizzie's history was scattered across multiple counties and jurisdictions, none of which talked to each other. There was no database, no background check, no system that could have flagged a woman with a trail of dead and missing husbands stretching back 2 decades. Paul saw a wife. What he got was something the 19th century had no vocabulary for. The marriage unraveled almost immediately. Lizzie's behavior became increasingly erratic in ways that alarmed everyone within a mile of the Halliday farm. She picked fights with neighbors. She vanished for days without explanation, but sometimes turning up in towns several counties away with no coherent account of where she had been. She threatened Paul openly. And then there were the fires. Again. Structures on the Halliday property caught fire with a frequency that defied coincidence. Barns, outbuildings. The pattern she had carried from previous marriages followed her into this one like a signature. Neighbors saw the smoke and understood what it meant. But the legal threshold for intervention in 1890s rural New York was remarkably high. A wife behaving erratically was a domestic matter. A barn fire without a witness was an accident. And a husband who was afraid of his own wife was, in the language of the time, simply unfortunate. Paul Halliday reportedly tried to have Lizzie committed at least once. She was briefly institutionalized, evaluated, and released. The details of that evaluation are sparse, but the outcome is telling. Whatever the doctors saw, it was not enough to keep her confined. She returned to the farm. Paul remained trapped in a marriage he could not safely exit. And then Paul Halliday vanished. He stopped appearing at the general store. He stopped tending his fields. Neighbors who had grown accustomed to the chaos at the Halliday property noticed something worse than the usual commotion. Silence. For weeks, nobody could confirm whether Paul was alive, dead, or simply gone. The community started asking questions, but quietly, because asking questions about Lizzie Halliday carried its own risks. What happened to Paul would not be confirmed for months. But by the time investigators finally turned their attention to the Halliday farm, that Paul's disappearance would be the least disturbing thing they uncovered. The property that bore his name was about to become the most infamous piece of farmland in the state of New York, and Lizzie was still living on it. The smell came first, then the flies, then the kind of silence that makes grown men stop walking and reconsider why they volunteered for the search party. In 1893, two women named Margaret McQuillan and her daughter Sarah went missing in Sullivan County. They were not wealthy. They were not prominent. They were the kind of people whose absence takes days to register because nobody important is waiting for them. But eventually, someone noticed. And eventually, the search led exactly where the neighbors had feared it would, to the Halliday farm. Now, under this point, everything about Lizzie had been suspicion, rumor, uneasy feelings that never quite solidified into evidence. The fires could have been accidents. The missing husbands could have wandered off. The erratic behavior could have been eccentricity. People in Sullivan County had spent years telling themselves comfortable versions of the truth because the uncomfortable version was too frightening to act on. That comfort ended the moment investigators lifted the floorboards. The remains of Margaret and Sarah McQuillan were discovered concealed beneath the farmhouse. The details, which were reported extensively in the press at the time, confirmed what the community had refused to believe. These were not natural deaths. These were not accidents. This was deliberate violence against two women who had the terrible misfortune of being in Lizzie Halliday's orbit at the wrong moment. Around the same time, searchers also located the remains of Paul Halliday on the property. The farmer who had married Lizzie, who had tried and failed to have her committed, who had spent his final months reportedly living in fear, was found not far from where the McQuillan women had been concealed. His disappearance, which the community had wondered about in polite whispers for weeks, was no longer a mystery. It was a confirmation. Lizzie was arrested, and for the first time, the full scope of her history spilled into public view. Not just the McQuillan case, not just Paul. Everything. The earlier husbands, the fires, the thefts, the constant movement from town to town. Yet journalists descended on Sullivan County like locusts, and the story they assembled was almost too sensational to believe. Newspapers across the country competed to find the most dramatic language for what Lizzie represented. They settled on a phrase that would follow her for the rest of her life, and well beyond it. They called her the worst woman in America. Whether that title was accurate or simply irresistible to editors selling papers is a question worth sitting with. Because what the press did next, the way they inflated, distorted, and weaponized Lizzie's story, would shape public memory of this case for over a century. And not all of it was true. But the part that was true was more than enough. 3 confirmed victims, 1 farmhouse, and a woman the system had watched for 20 years without once finding the will to stop her. Yet Lizzie Halliday sat in the courtroom like she had been inconvenienced, not accused of triple homicide. Her trial began in 1894, and from the very first day, it was clear that this was not going to be a normal legal proceeding. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from New York City, Philadelphia, and as far as Chicago fought for seats. Spectators lined up outside the building before dawn, not because they cared about justice, but because Lizzie Halliday had become the most talked about woman in the country, and everyone wanted to see the monster for themselves. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. The McQuillan women. Paul Halliday. The physical evidence recovered from the farm. The timeline of Lizzie's movements in the weeks before and after the disappearances. It was direct, it was grim, and it was persuasive. But the prosecution also did something else, something the defense would later try to use. They invited the press narrative into the courtroom. The earlier husbands, the fires, the thefts, the decades of chaos that preceded the confirmed killings. All of it was presented not as proven fact, but as context. A portrait of a woman whose entire adult life had been a slow escalation toward the violence that finally caught up with her. The defense had a simpler argument. Lizzie was insane. Not insane as a legal strategy, they argued, but genuinely, profoundly unwell in ways that the system had recognized and then ignored. She had been institutionalized before. She had been evaluated by doctors who noted severe disturbance. And she had been released anyway because the infrastructure for long-term psychiatric confinement barely existed, and the beds that did exist were already full. The defense was not saying Lizzie was innocent. They were saying she was broken, and that the state bore some responsibility for putting her back into a community it knew she would harm. The jury was not persuaded by the sympathy angle. They convicted Lizzie Halliday and sentenced her to death. But here is where the story pivots in a direction nobody expected. The sentence was appealed. Doctors re-examined Lizzie and concluded, this time with more authority, that she was legally insane. The death sentence was commuted. Instead of execution, Lizzie was transferred to the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane. A facility designed to hold exactly the kind of person the courts did not know what else to do with. The public reaction was furious. Newspapers that had spent months calling her the worst woman in America now turned their outrage toward the legal system that had spared her life. How could a woman responsible for at least 3 deaths be allowed to live? The courts maintained that the law required it. The press maintained that the law was wrong. And Lizzie, behind the walls of Matteawan, had already stopped being a person. She was now a symbol. Of what exactly depended on who was telling the story. The walls of Matteawan were supposed to be the end of the story. They were not. After her death sentence was commuted in the mid-1890s, Lizzie Halliday was transferred to the Matteawan State Hospital for the criminally insane in Beacon, New York. The facility housed the state's most dangerous patients, people the legal system had decided were too unstable to execute, but too violent to release. It was, in theory, the final chapter. Lizzie would live out her remaining years under constant supervision, removed from a society she had terrorized for over 2 decades. The public was angry, but the assumption was at least she could not hurt anyone else. That assumption held for about 12 years. For most of that stretch, Lizzie faded from public attention. The newspapers that had once competed for the most dramatic headline moved on to fresher horrors. The name Halliday, which had once sold papers from coast to coast, slipped into the archives. Inside Matteawan, Lizzie aged. While she became part of the institution's routine, one more patient among dozens of others the world preferred to forget about. Staff rotated. Budgets shrank. The initial urgency of her confinement softened into something closer to bureaucratic maintenance. Then, in 1906, Lizzie killed again. Her victim was a nurse named Nellie Wickies. The attack happened inside the facility, carried out with a pair of scissors. Nellie Wicks was a staff member doing her job in a place that was specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of violence. She was not a random target. She was a woman who had regular contact with Lizzie, which means the institution had placed her in proximity to a convicted killer without the safeguards necessary to protect her. Nellie Wicks died from her injuries, and the questions that followed were devastating. Yet how does a woman already convicted of multiple homicides, already declared criminally insane, already confined to a maximum security psychiatric facility, manage to take another life? The answer pointed to something the public did not want to hear. Matteawan was underfunded. It was overcrowded. Staff were spread thin across a patient population that included some of the most dangerous individuals in the state. The systems meant to prevent violence inside the facility had eroded to the point where a patient could access a weapon and use it before anyone intervened. The killing of Nellie Wicks did not lead to a second trial. Lizzie was already confined for life. There was no further punishment the legal system could impose that it had not already tried and failed to enforce. She remained at Matteawan, now under tighter restrictions. Though the fact that tighter restrictions were available and had not been applied earlier made the whole arrangement look worse, not better. Lizzie Halliday had proven something the courts never wanted to admit. Containment is not the same thing as control. Lizzie Halliday died at Matteawan in 1918. No family claimed the body. No funeral was held. No headstone was placed. The woman once branded the worst in America left the world the same way she entered it, alone, undocumented, and belonging to no one. But her death did not settle the question that had followed her for 3 decades. How many people did Lizzie Halliday actually kill? The confirmed number is 4. Margaret McQuillan, Sarah McQuillan, Paul Halliday, Nellie Wicks. These are the deaths supported by physical evidence, legal proceedings, and documented investigation. They are beyond reasonable dispute. But the press of the 1890s did not stop at 4. Newspapers attributed as many as a dozen victims to Lizzie, folding every missing husband, every unexplained death, every suspicious fire into a narrative that grew more sensational with each edition. Some of those claims may have been true. Others were almost certainly invented by journalists who understood that a serial killer with 12 victims sells more papers than one with 4. The honest reckoning with Lizzie's story requires separating what we know from what we assume. And what we know is already disturbing enough without embellishment. We know that at least 2 of her former husbands died under circumstances that were never investigated. But we know that fires followed her across multiple marriages and multiple counties. We know that she was evaluated by doctors, briefly institutionalized, and released back into a community that had no resources to monitor her. We know that every system designed to protect the people around her failed, repeatedly, for over 20 years. What we do not know is whether those earlier deaths were homicides. The autopsies were never performed. The evidence was never collected. The questions were never asked. And that absence of inquiry is, in some ways, the most damning part of the entire story. It was not that Lizzie was too clever to catch. It was that nobody tried. This is where her case stops being a true crime curiosity and becomes something more uncomfortable. The Lizzie Halliday operated in the gaps of a system that did not track transient women, did not coordinate across county lines, did not take domestic violence seriously, and did not invest in psychiatric care until someone was already dead. She was not invisible because she was cunning. She was invisible because the country she lived in was not built to see people like her. By the time it finally looked, there were bodies under the floorboards. If Lizzie Halliday's story unsettled something in you, if it made you wonder how many other cases slipped through the cracks of a system designed to look the other way, then you are asking the right questions. And those questions deserve to be heard. Hit subscribe, because the next story on this channel digs into a case the authorities buried even deeper. And if this one stayed with you, press that like button. Consider it your vote that some stories should never be forgotten, no matter how badly the record tried to erase them.